Finally tonight, a rare look at that rare part of the world called Antarctica. It is the look of Bill Baker, president of public station WNET New York. He visited Antarctica in December.
Antarctica, located at the bottom of the world, is the kind of place best described in superlatives. It holds the record for the lowest temperature ever recorded, minus 128 degrees. It's the highest continent with an ice cap more than 2 miles thick in spots. It's got the largest supply of fresh water, 70% of the world's total frozen in that ice. Yet it's the world's largest desert, with annual precipitation rivaling that of the Sahara. Antarctica is also the most pristine, most majestic place I've ever seen. I flew to Antarctica last December in the middle of the Antarctic summer and landed at the main American base on McMurdo Sound. McMurdo has grown a lot since I last saw it 15 years ago. An ugly hodgepodge of utilitarian buildings, it's now home to almost 1,000 scientists and Navy personnel. In March, when the dark Antarctic winter begins, that number will shrink to about 200. None of the scientists I met during my 8-day visit had a greater appreciation for what makes Antarctica unique than glaciologist Charles Swithenbank. Swithenbank has been studying polar ice in the Antarctic and the Arctic for 39 years.
The basic contrast is that the Arctic is an ocean, and the average thickness of ice over the whole Arctic Ocean is only 10 feet. The average thickness of ice in the Antarctic is about 8,000 feet. That is the big difference, 10 feet versus 8,000 feet. An ocean versus a continent with an enormous ice cap sitting on it.
Because Antarctica is a continent and remote and unsullied, it offers unique opportunities for scientific research. To date, 21 nations have taken advantage of those opportunities by building bases here. This is New Zealand's Scott Base near McMurdo. The head of New Zealand's program is David Creer.
The reasons for New Zealand having an interest in the Antarctica are twofold. Firstly, we're here for the science. The second reason for being here is, of course, that the New Zealand government requires a physical presence in Antarctica. New Zealand is a member of the Antarctic Treaty Organisation and requires a presence in order to preserve that interest.
The 1959 Antarctica Treaty currently has 40 nations that have signed it or acceded to its conditions. The treaty was written to preserve Antarctica for peaceful use and to promote scientific research. Military maneuvers, weapons testing, disposal of radioactive waste are all forbidden here. Conflicting territorial claims are dealt with simply by agreeing to disagree. In almost 30 years since it took effect, the treaty has worked brilliantly. Antarctica, an area equal to continental United States and Mexico, has become one large scientific laboratory. This year, the National Science Foundation, which runs the U.S. Antarctic program, is managing about 75 research projects. Raymond Teen, a graduate student at the University of Illinois, is studying why Antarctic fish don't freeze. He and his colleagues have identified a protein in cod that acts like antifreeze.
It's a small protein which actually binds to specific faces of the ice crystal. And once it binds there, it inhibits growth, further growth of the crystal.
Jeff Peterson of Princeton University is studying how the solar system is formed.
We're trying to study the formation of galaxies, and so we're looking for the seeds of those galaxies. Long ago, very weak light was emitted by those forming galaxies that we can view today.
In Antarctica, everybody is part of the scientific research, even these penguins. Scientists keep count of them in order to find out what is happening with the whale population.
They are correlating the increasing number of penguins to an increase in the availability of krill, their prime food source. And they think that this could be related to the slaughter of whales. The fewer whales, the more krill, the more penguins.
All of this research is possible because of the international harmony created by the Antarctic Treaty. Unfortunately, the treaty comes up for review in 1991, and some people fear claims by third world nations may shatter the spirit of cooperation. But Sidney Dragon, director of the U.S. program in Antarctica, says he's not worried.
From all of the evidence that I have, I don't think that the treaty will undergo any significant review in 1991. A lot of people think that the Antarctic Treaty expires in 1991. It doesn't. What happens in 1991 is that the parties to the treaty may come to a decision that certain parts of the treaty need to be reviewed, but we really don't see that happening.
For the Antarctic traveler, the highlight of the trip, assuming he can find space on the weekly supply flight, is a visit to the South Pole. The pole is 720 miles from McMurdo, 4.5 hours flying time. Today the trip is simple, but imagine what it was like 77 years ago when British explorer Robert Falcon Scott set out to become the first to reach the South Pole. His expedition of 16 men, ponies, dogs, and motor sledges trekked across the ice for 11 weeks. When Scott arrived at the pole, after incredible hardships, he found the Norwegian flag of Roald Amundsen already planted there. Amundsen had beaten him by only 1 month. When we arrived, we found both the British and the Norwegian flags, along with 10 others representing the original signatories to the Antarctic Treaty. 12 flags, but only 1 base. Behind me stands the Amundsen Scott South Pole Station. This is the U.S. base at the South Pole. Living under that dome are some 100 scientists, most of them monitoring changes in the Earth's climate and air quality. The South Pole is an ideal spot for such measurements because it has the cleanest air in the world.
That's our carbon dioxide.
One thing they're watching very closely is the level of carbon dioxide in the atmosphere. As CO2 increases, it could cause a warming of the Earth's climate. Scientists say this so-called greenhouse effect could melt the polar ice caps, raising ocean levels and causing flooding worldwide. At least one Antarctic lake has already begun to melt. Scientists don't know yet whether the warming is just a local condition or more widespread. Scientists here are also monitoring ozone depletion caused by man-made gases called chlorofluorocarbons. 2 years ago, a large hole developed in the stratospheric ozone above the pole. Scientists were concerned because the ozone acts as a shield protecting all living things from the sun's deadly ultraviolet B radiation. The head of the South Pole's air quality program is Betsy Crozier.
This year we haven't really observed the hole that we observed last year, which is due to meteorological phenomenon, the fact that we haven't observed it. Perhaps this coming year, if the stratospheric temperatures are colder, we will see another ozone hole over the South Pole. This year the hole was shifted, and so it wasn't over the South Pole.
We stayed 2 days at the pole. When we got back, we took a short pilgrimage to a place and a time when Antarctic life was much more primitive. The place was Robert Falcon Scott's hut at Cape Evans, 50 miles from McMurdo. The time was 1912. Inside, all the provisions were still there. So were the cooking utensils, even a pair of old boots. It seemed as if Scott might return at any moment. But Scott never did make it back. 10 months after he reached the pole, a rescue party found him and 2 other members of his team frozen on the ice. Scott's hut sits there, a symbol of a time when only a courageous few dared to come here. Today, Antarctica has about 5,000 summer inhabitants, plus occasional tourists, all of them generating waste that has to be disposed of. The U.S. is modernizing its facilities. Other nations have built new bases anticipating an agreement to develop Antarctica's mineral resources. In the future, there will be more scientists, more tourists, more trucks and supplies, and more pollution. Environmental groups like Greenpeace charge that the areas around some of these bases are already being polluted. Toxic chemicals have been found in McMurdo Sound. McMurdo Base is still burning solid waste in open pits and dumping diluted raw sewage into the water. Officials say the pollution is minor, and they are disposing of waste as best they can.
As far as polluting in terms of sewage, we mix sewage with brine, macerate it, and dump it into Sound. We meet all treaty requirements. We're do much better than many of the the seaside small towns in Maine and places in California.
Oh, of course there's a human impact. There must be, and there's nothing that we can do that will lessen some of the physical impact. We use diesel generators, we use petrol or JP4 fueled vehicles, aircraft to get around. But that impact on the real scale of things in the Antarctic cannot really be measured. It is so slight.
When an Argentine supply ship ran aground recently and began spilling diesel fuel, many people realized for the first time just how fragile the Antarctic's ecosystem really is. Officials say the oil slick could produce an incurable disaster, harming the aquatic food chain, threatening penguin rookeries, and spoiling 20 years of research. These penguins on McMurdo Sound, more than 2,000 miles from the spill, are safe, but no one knows for how long. Environmentalists warn that the tragedy could be a taste of more disasters to come. Charles Swithenbank remembers Antarctica before pollution was a threat, before all the people came.
When I first came down, we were looking at mountains which you could say to yourself, no human being in the last 1,000 million years has cast eyes on these mountains. And that is a privilege. I stand in awe and I feel very humble. And that's one of the wonderful things about coming to the Antarctic, the power of the place and how small human beings feel. And somehow I feel that's healthy.
Once again, the main points in today's news. President Bush returned from a 5-day Asian